Lately, I've been really interested in the concept of form factor and its effect on the gamers, especially when it comes to video games. Now, we've seen massive market growth this year with handheld PCs, as well as a really cool boom in emulation devices, each offering a unique take on their own designs. Personally, I've owned more consoles and handhelds and controllers than I can even count, and yet when it comes to form factor, I've always just been a trust your gut kind of guy, meaning if it feels good, if it looks good, then surely enough it must be good. However, as my collection has grown over the years, I've become more and more curious as to why a particular item is considered to have a good form factor and why that is so important. So today I want to delve into the psychology of video game form factor and its effect on the player and why this is so important. So welcome back to the channel, my nerds. Hope you're having a great day. Let's get into it. At the heart of any game's design is the goal of immersion, the player's ability to become fully absorbed into the game world to the point where both natural and psychological boundaries between different realities are dissolving. Proper form factor plays a massive and critical role in achieving this immersion. The human brain processes information from our surroundings and constructs an internal model of the world, interpreting sensory data in real time. When designing games, developers aim to engage as many of the senses as possible, from the tactile sensation of controllers and handhelds to the visual and auditory feedback within the game world. The concept of form factor and its connection to immersion can actually be quite complicated. The goal of controller design, keyboard design, and even handheld systems is to not only create a positive reaction in its standalone state, but also to the virtual side of a game and its UI and UX designs. And when any part of this relationship is unbalanced, it can create the sense of ew for the player. Now, a great example of this is playing VR chat with a keyboard versus playing VR chat with like a MetaQuest system, for example. Sure, both are technically playable, but the VR setup is by far the most immersive experience, especially when you consider the freedom of a wireless headset and its lightweight form factor when worn by the player. Now, I know when it comes to form factor, especially for gaming devices, I know when a game device is bad when I'm constantly reminded that I'm using that device. This can be prompted by clunky and uncomfortable designs of a controller or a handheld device, and that will often lead to hand fatigue, causing gaming sessions to be shortened. Now, when I forget that I'm holding onto a gaming device or controller because of its comfort, I get to be immersed far easier and longer periods of time, allowing me to stay in a flow state while gaming. Psychologist Mihaly, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce that last name, his concept of flow is pivotal to understanding how immersion functions in relation to form factor. Flow occurs when a person is fully engaged in an activity that challenges their skills without overwhelming them or burdening them. The form factor, through intuitive controls and balanced difficulty curves and a responsive game environment, is integral to the flow state and one's perception of a positive form factor. Games like Dark Souls masterfully create this sense of flow, providing both challenging gameplay and satisfaction in controller inputs, assuming you're using an Xbox controller or a PS controller, or even a keyboard. The sense of flow for Dark Souls, in my opinion, is greatly interrupted if playing on, for example, the Nintendo Switch, which is arguably the worst way to experience that game. In fact, if that were the only way you were ever to experience Dark Souls, it could really have a negative impact on your perception of that game's design. In reality, using that cramped Joy-Con is just a poor way to explore Dark Souls. Now, even though Joy-Cons, in my opinion, don't have the greatest form factor, this is not at all to say that Joy-Cons have horrible form factor and their standalone function. I believe that Joy-Cons work for the games they were designed for, like Super Mario Odyssey, where your character is largely controlled with a joystick and pressing various combinations with the A button. However, when compared to the Nintendo Pro controller, which is, in my opinion, the best way to play Switch titles, it really does pale in comparison. That is, at least until you use the Switch in undocked mode, where the Joy-Cons have a slightly greater edge in the overall user experience due to the Switch's game library and its portability. Now, when discussing player connection to a game, one of the most profound ways that video games engage players psychologically is through physical interaction, especially via the game controller or a handheld device. These devices act as an extension of the player's body, becoming a part of the experience, often without the player even realizing it. The psychology behind controller design really revolves around embodiment theory, which suggests that the physical interface between a person and their environment, whether it's psychological or physical, directly impacts how that person perceives and interacts with the world around them. Now, a really good example of this is emulation devices, and specifically when an emulation device has a bad or poorly made D-pad. Many emulation devices aim to bring all the classics under one roof, and yet that boast means very little if the D-pad is designed poorly, especially since the D-pad is so important for older games like many of the 2D Mario platformers or even some of the fighting games. A poor design of something as simple as a D-pad can actually make a game unplayable, which really speaks to the importance of form factor ergonomics. Now, when we speak of ergonomics, this does not just affect the oldies, it actually plays a vital role in ensuring that players are comfortable during prolonged modern gaming sessions. A poorly designed controller, which may lead to physical discomfort or even strain, can really undermine the gaming experience, causing distractions and breaking the sense of the player's immersion. This is particularly crucial for games that demand precision, like competitive shooters, where the ability to execute quick actions really requires a player to feel connected to the game through the controller. A really interesting study on the human-computer interaction. This study often highlights the importance of comfort. Norman's theory of action, 1988, suggests that the ease which a user can perform an action, even from holding a controller to executing a move in the game, directly influences the user's perception of system usability. The PlayStation controller with the DualSense, for example, has been praised for its adaptive triggers and haptic feedback, which allows players to feel even more connected to the game world. The controller's form factor is built to evoke the sense of touch that mimics real-world actions, such as the resistance of a bowstring or the sensation of walking through different surfaces. The incorporation of haptic feedback is one of the most innovative aspects of modern controller design. It involves the use of vibrations and motions to simulate real-world physical sensations. In games like Resident Evil Village, haptic feedback can provide subtle cues that correspond to the actions of the game world, such as recoil from a firearm or the rumbling of footsteps in the distance. From a psychological perspective, haptic feedback taps into the somatic marker hypothesis, which argues that physical sensations contribute to decision-making and emotional processing. In other words, when players actually feel the vibrations or motions from a controller, it can actually deepen their emotional connection to the game, increasing engagement and their overall sense of presence. The body becomes more emotionally attuned to the virtual environment, heightening the sense of realism and the emotional stakes within the game. And ultimately, all of this affects the form factor rating. Now, any true gamer will know that video games can function as both entertainment and mental exercise, and that the design of form factor plays a crucial role in determining how cognitive load a player experiences. Now, cognitive load theory, developed by John Sweller, determines that there is a finite amount of mental energy available at any point for any task. If a task is too cognitively demanding, it can result in mental fatigue or even disengagement. And this timeline, especially in relation to gaming, can be drastically affected by form factor, whether it's for handhelds, keyboards, or even controllers. I mean, imagine trying to play your favorite video game and having to use the most atrocious and uncomfortable controller. It won't matter that it's your favorite, because that gaming session will be totally tainted from discomfort. We can even go as far as saying that video game form factor has a direct impact on emotional regulation, which can be understood through theories of emotional contagion and effective computing. These concepts suggest that the emotional tone of a game is not just a reflection of its content, but also the design choices that trigger the emotions in the player through interactions, sensory feedback, and pacing. Again, all of which are connected to form factor, in which the game is ultimately experienced. Now, video game form factor, though seemingly a technical element of game design, has a profound psychological impact on players. The interplay between hardware design, user interface, controller ergonomics, and yes, even the emotional depth of gameplay all contribute to the player's cognitive, emotional, and social experience. Now, understanding how all these elements work together to create this immersive and gaming, emotional resonance, this all reveals the deeper layers of form factor and its connection to the human psyche. Now, this entire video really was birthed out of a experience I had recently, which is playing AAA titles on the Switch, specifically titles that were not meant for the Switch during its initial release, like The Witcher 3, for example. I am a collector, so I really like getting all the Switch titles, and I've acquired a few AAA titles that didn't launch with Switch and have tried playing them on Switch, and it birthed the concept of why form factor is so important to me, and ultimately how it affects other players and their psychological experience of games. When it came to Witcher 3, game's arguably and probably one of the best open world games you can play. However, experiencing on Switch really tainted that experience. I think it was a cool gimmick that I could play Witcher 3 on the go, which is why I bought the title, but then I realized, well, if I really want to experience Witcher 3, it should be experienced to its full extent, and the way to do that would either be through a Steam Deck or a ROG Ally X, for example. And the Nintendo Switch design actually had a serious impact on not only how the world felt in using the Joy-Cons to maneuver through the space, but also just the way that the buttons felt. It made the world feel odd. Compare that to playing on Steam with an Xbox controller, for example. Many times I would forget I was even holding an Xbox controller because I was so immersed in the game. And that really is where this video is birthed from, is really experiencing titles that I care about and settings that they don't necessarily click the way I want them to. And so I wanted to include some psychology as well, just because I wanted to bring some validity to why form factor is so important. Now, if you like this video, please consider giving it a like, subscribe, share it with your grandma, because my YouTube analytics tell me that I have like 99% male audience. So I'm trying to get, the grandma audience watching these videos. So share it with your grandma. And yeah, until next time, I hope you have a great day. Check out my other videos, and bye-bye.